One of the most fun things we do at the festival is launch new books. It's always really exciting when, books make their first appearance in the world right here at Bocas. And I think that's almost the case. Some of you may actually have these books already, but as far as the books and the authors are concerned, this is the first time you're ever hearing about them or seeing them. This is the debut of 2 books of short fiction by 2 Trinidadian writers. I'm going to hand over in a second to Colin Robinson, who's going to be leading the conversation this afternoon. But I just want to say, first of all, congratulations to the 2 writers, to Breanne McIvor, who's just published her first book. First book of short fiction, and we hope it's the beginning of a long and very productive career. And also to say congratulations and welcome back to Anton Nimblett, who is a Trinidadian writer who lives in Brooklyn, who's just published his 2nd book of stories. Please congratulate him. We're thrilled to have them here. So what's going to happen is as I said, I'll hand over to Colin, but both writers will read from their work. They're going to talk about their work. They're going to find some, tease out what are the links and connections between these 2 very different books. And the last thing I want to remind you is it is a book launch, and there are books for sale from the booksellers outside, and both authors will be very happy to sign the books for you. Hopefully each will sign his or her own book and not the others, but the authors will be very happy for you to sign books afterwards. So thanks very much for coming. Colin, it's all yours. Everyone, please welcome them on stage.
Great. Nicholas has done a lot of the introduction. I was going to keep it relatively brief. Breanne has moved from West Trinidad to England and Scotland and then back home again. Anton has moved from South and Central Trinidad to Brooklyn. Anton's going to lead us off with, Breanne's going to lead us off with an excerpt from the book, and then we're going to have a bit of a discussion.
Hi, everybody. I'm just going to read a little bit from one of the short stories. Is this better? So this is called The Course, and it's a supernatural mystery. He's always had thirsty skin. Sitting in the rain, washing off the dirt from last night's exploits, he lets his paws drink. The air is streaked with thunder. He spent the earliest part of the morning retching up a chunky concoction brindled with blood. Tendrils of wispy hair have wrapped themselves around his fingers. There is no way hair like that could have belonged to an adult. A child, he thinks, feeling sicker. He doesn't know for sure, though. He can never remember. Looking through the rain, he sees Coraline's face behind the window. Her terracotta curls swirl around her head in an early morning mess. When the clouds have bled themselves dry, Coraline picks her way through the puddles. It happened again last night, she tells him. I know it happened. It is the thing neither of them knows. They tried to medicate it with doctor's visits, sleeping pills, and hypnosis. But it still leaves their doors hanging off hinges, scratched as if a giant wolf were trying to get out. It leaves Coraline to wake up to his torn clothes and an empty house. There is a local word for men who turn into monsters, lagahu, but they have come to an unspoken agreement to never say the word aloud. After all, neither he nor she has ever witnessed it. You remember it? She asks. He hates the high, hopeful sound of her voice, almost making him wish he could remember. No, but I've been throwing up all morning. the first filaments of sunlight find their way through the clouds. Mrs. Cooper called this morning, Coraline says. She asked if we saw her daughter. He barely has time to lean forward before the sludge bursts from his lips. His throat convulses with wave after wave, and even when his stomach is empty, he keeps heaving. Coraline has somehow sidestepped the vomit. Cor, you must know that I would never... I know, she says gently. She stoops down and runs her fingers through his hair. Still, I've been researching what we could do about it. Researching? Of course, she says. I think there are alternative channels we can use. Maybe visit a non-traditional doctor. Non-traditional doctor? You mean Obia? She brings her teeth to her lower lip and chews as if tasting the word. Yes, Obia, she says eventually. Where would he or she find a practitioner? The thought of Coraline asking around for someone who dabbles in the occult is ridiculous. I Googled it, she says, as if he'd spoken aloud. And seeing his face, she continues, they're business people like anyone else. They need to advertise their services. He isn't sure he can trust an Obia man who advertises online. What would an Obia man do? Pay for a Facebook ad? He wants to say, this sounds absurd. But isn't his whole life an absurdity? Why not? Now that they've discussed it, he's amazed that they haven't tried it sooner. She holds a slim arm out and helps him to his feet. He wipes the last of the bile from around his mouth. I suppose we could give it a shot, he says. The road to the northern range was chiseled into the edge of the mountain long ago. Their car winds through its curves. To their right, the precipice gapes green. Trees have clawed their way up the steep rock face and are growing where he would not have thought anything could grow. So you really found this man on Google? It's a woman, Coraline says. In the car, a string quartet is playing Michael Jackson's Human Nature. Coraline is the only person he knows who listens to this kind of music. He doesn't know enough about the music to be able to hear the instruments speak to each other like she does. When they first started dating, she would say things like, listen to the first violin. But she'd stop that. Maybe because she didn't want him to feel as if she were lording her upbringing over him. She'd been born to parents who played classical music at dinner and who discussed, in dead seriousness, whether Shakespeare was more of a comic or tragic genius. Do you know what I'm thinking? Coraline asks. He imagines that she's thinking that if she were in love with another man, she wouldn't have to go through this. No, he says. I was thinking that if this works, if you get better, maybe we can talk about having a baby. A flock of parrots rises from the canopy in a fury of flapping. He can't believe it. A baby? How could she even put such a thought into words? More than that, Coraline has never been the type to want traditional things. Wasn't that part of the reason she'd asked him out? Wasn't that the reason why, after years of dating, she told him that she didn't believe in marriage? Suddenly he's aware that the car is very small and cold, and even if he wanted to get out, there's nothing but trees around them. There seem to be no words to capture the monstrosity of his aversion. Coraline turned 30 last month. Is this some sort of feminine thing, where she's worried that her woman's clock is ticking her baby-making years away? Cora, he says, trusting that she will hear the meaning in his voice, as she does with the violins. I mean, we wouldn't do it until we're sure that you're better, she says. Only her hands betray her. The knuckles squeezing the steering wheel are bright red. Is this something you really want? He asks. Yes. Look, I know you're worried, but you would never hurt our baby. I know it. How can she know it? When they started living together, she thought he sometimes went to the bar down the road at night. He told her the truth. He couldn't really remember those nights. But he never told her about the disfigured shreds of human bodies that he woke up with. Skin under his fingernails, a mangled earlobe clutched in his palm, hair wrapped around his fingers. Somehow she connected clues he wasn't aware of leaving. And even then, she hadn't left. Was it because she loved him? But why would someone like her love someone like him at all, let alone enough to stay? He thinks of Mrs. Cooper's daughter. A few months after she was born, Mrs. Cooper pushed her around in a pink pram, showing her off to the neighborhood. He remembers the awful smallness of the baby's hands. How could hands that feeble do anything? He'd taken the baby's foot in his own large palm and marveled that a whole human foot could nestle so snugly in his hand. No, best not to think about it. The deepest string instrument is groaning. Is that the viola or the cello? He's not sure. Coraline turns up a steep road. The car is almost vertical, and he wonders whether they can manage this ascent. Her lips are mashed into one another as if she can drag the car up by willpower alone. All around them is green. The car keeps climbing until they've reached what is apparently the end of the road. Coraline reverses into a minuscule space between a mora tree and a yellow pui. If she is afraid, she doesn't show it. There's nothing here, he says, and he's surprised to feel relief. Coraline insists, this is the place. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Breanne, and congratulations to both of you. The collections are 29 stories between them, and they're all quite intriguing, but in some very different ways. This is Breanne's first collection, which I know is a particular milestone as a writer. Sometimes the second collection is harder than the first, and I wanted you to share a little bit about how the collections came together and what they're trying to do in the world.
So yeah, there's definitely that feeling of the second collection being a different challenge. Certainly, I'll call it different, right? So the thing when, at least for me, when I was writing the first book, sort of like I'm writing, and the challenge is like to get it out there for somebody to see it, right? And so now with the second collection, you start writing, and you're like, oh gosh, people are going to see this. That was definitely one of the challenges with this. Where this book came from, there's kind of a concept and a theme throughout it. And it comes from a sense of having missed out on stuff. We talked the other day on the Inheriting Naipaul's Legacy about people like me who no longer live in the place where they came from, and the relationship and the longing and the conflicted feelings about the distance and home. And one of the things that was a challenge for me is I left when I was 13. I left after Form 2. And so I hadn't read Caribbean literature the way that I would have if I'd lived here all my life. I got to Brooklyn and nothing, right? Got to college and nothing, not one. So I felt like I was catching up. And so there's this period, this thing that I consciously tried to do is to sort of like engage with reading Caribbean literature. And as I was doing that, there was this moment where I wanted to be engaged with it through the writing. And of course, there's precedent for that. you know, White Sargasso Sea kind of thing. I was like, okay, but I don't want to write a novel. I love the short story form, and so here's another collection of short stories. I love reading short stories. I love writing them. And so then this is what we have. We have 9 stories in here, and each one speaks to a different work that's already in the world. So, yeah.
So my process was a bit different. When I started writing short stories, I don't think I was even thinking about a collection. I would just write a short story, move on, maybe send it to a competition or let my friends read it. And I actually had quite a body of work before I said, okay, well, let me look at these stories, see if anything pulls them together, if there's any way to bring them together. And my friends reading my stories would say things to me like, wow, you're such a dark person. And I would say, oh, you think so? You know, friendly, nice. But when I was reading the stories, this idea of monsters, big and small, and the different ways that we encounter monsters or that we can be monsters was the one thread that sort of ran through most of my stories. So I pulled them together to see what I had to be kind of ruthless and say, okay, this might have been okay when I was 21, but honestly, it's really bad and you can't save it. Let's just do away with that one. And then try to fill in the gaps in between. The collection's divided into 2 sections. The first one is Where There Are Monsters, and that dealt with some of the stories that I had and a couple new ones that I wrote, where you're basically the good guy. You're dealing with things that are bad and things that are dangerous, and that's the easier part, because if I can just overcome this, I'll be fine. And the second section is Where We Are Monsters, and that's a little bit more challenging, because that deals with, okay, well, sometimes the problem's you, or sometimes you're the villain. And again, both big and small, people who are sort of an outright villain and they know it, and people who are trying to grapple with it. So I think that's how I came up with the idea eventually, and that's what I'm trying to do.
I want to come back and talk a little bit more about some of the intertextuality in both collections. In Where There Are Monsters, there's this dialogue with folklore, with Trinidadian and Caribbean folklore. And as you mentioned, Anton, in your work, there's this dialogue with canon, with both the Caribbean and the more global English language canon. And then there are the shorter pieces that are interspersed between the longer pieces. So I want to talk a little bit about that and about form, but first let's hear from Anton. In terms of reading.
Oh, I could do that.
All right.
So, you know, love seeing you all here. It's a particular thrill to be reading in Trinidad. And I love looking out and seeing Jeremy and Hannah from my publisher here. Thank them for making this a reality. I'm going to read from a story called Pharaoh. And all of the stories that speak back have epigrams. This is the most familiar and probably predictable one, because it says, "He said is my imagination, but I know I hear in the basement the mighty shadow." 4 a.m. Ash Wednesday, 1974, a panyard in an outlying neighborhood of Port of Spain. Sunrise, 2 hours away. The lights of the previous night gone. A nearby lamppost stands lonely. Gone the sounds of the last day, gone the raucous brass and steel, the flights of melody and harmony, rebel rhythms and blended revelry. Gone the off-key notes made beautiful by the crowd. Yet after the sound, there is not absence of sound. Listen close for lingering echoes, tiny, easy-to-miss shadows in mutable light. From deep in the panyard, a figure speaks, the voice soft, deliberate. First to begin, I'm not from hell. Don't fucking listen to Winston. I ain't from hell. I'm not no blasted hellion. Now man have everybody believing I is his enemy. The whole flicking country taking life for truth, friend for enemy, taking help for harm. I ain't taking that, I fed up, and I ain't taking no more. Winston, man. Let me tell you something about Winston, eh? If it wasn't for me, you wouldn't know who he is. You wouldn't know, and nobody wouldn't care. If it wasn't for me, Winston would be pulling fisherman seine in Castara or joining wood somewhere down in Mamaral. Don't feel as gallery, and I just stating facts. I don't boast, I don't rhyme, I don't use $10 words like a mighty robber, like a midnight robber. As a plain talk man. The figure climbs from between steel pans at the rear of the pan yard. The pans are not carefully stacked. There's no order here as there was 2 nights ago. The pans mirror masqueraders at last lap, and the word that comes to mind is deshabille. So plain talk, bad manners. I working with Winston since he was a piss-and-tail little boy in Lecato Bush. Work, simple as that. Doing a job just like any preacher, teacher, or gravedigger. But it's a thankless work. After all, who you know does be glad to see the gravedigger? The figure sets right a pair of tenor pans, takes his time, arranges them carefully, brushes off the surface with his sleeve. We come a long way from Winston as a boy. We pass Winston leaving the village saying he wants to sing Kaiso, pass Winston trying to join this Calypso tent and the next, past the catch-ass days and the almost but not quite there yet music, past standing on the outside of this circle and that circle, standing outside too much circles to count. I was there with him doing the work. Whatever it takes to protect him, help him. But I ain't really trying to tell you all about Winston's life. I come a long way with Winston, man, and it's here we are. Here and now, Ash Wednesday morning, the whole country talking about Winston. The whole of Trinidad and Tobago have the tune ringing in their head. Every last body in this place singing that I is a bassman from hell. The figure removes slim pan sticks from his pants pocket. Slowly, deliberately, he plays a few notes, scales carefully. Then a melody, less slowly. Mary had a little lamb. He adjusts the pans, he adjusts his body, the distance between his feet, the distance between his torso and the pans. Then he begins the melody of the Calypso that on Ash Wednesday, 1974, everyone in this twin island nation knows by heart. He plays the melody of the verse once through, simple and straight, and then he plays the melody again, improvising, riffing on it. Mary had a little lamb seeping through like singing in rounds. His wrists flash strong and flexible. His pan sticks occupy multiple spaces at the same time. The playing is beautiful. Oh, you hear that? You hear me play them tenor pan? Winston say I is a bass man. What do you think? How it sound? It sound good, right? Of course it sound good. And this is and this ain't no bass drum here, right? There's a tenor pan. Yeah, man. I could stand up here and talk all morning long. I could fucking talk all day, talk for 40 days and 40 nights because it's Lent now, right? I could talk, but the best way to prove what I'm saying is to show you, right? Winston, lie. You see for yourself, I is not a bass man. Well, not just a bass man. And if you see that with your own eyes, you hear it with your own ears, then I don't have to say nothing else. The figure runs through the verse once more, virtuosity evident. This time he sings the lyrics to the song, planning to give up Calypso and go and plant peas in Tobago. He slows his playing to match the pace of his singing. He sings almost tuneless in stark contrast to the pretty pan notes he plays. He sings the verse again the second time, his voice rising sardonic. His features shift and his face speaks louder and louder of anger. His voice sharpens and rises with the last words. His voice drops then to a near whisper, a controlled, pitched, layered with so much emotion as to frighten. A man in my head, I want him to dead. I want him to dead. He stops playing, he drops the sticks. The figure stands still. He listens to the sound of his voice. Listen, I don't know what comes next. I don't have no idea what Winston going to do now. I don't know what I going to do. All this time, I working to get to a place, right? Working with Winston to get to a place. I working with Winston when he working with me, working when he running from me too. And well, it's not me he was running from, and it was never the work he was running from either. It ain't easy to be a calypsonian, a pan man, a bass man. It ain't easy. Half the time you're chasing after something, the right tune, the right words, the audience, the performance, waiting to be seen, to be heard, chasing and working and battling, man. It ain't easy to fight up so. But what even harder than that is the other half of the time, you're running from the same thing you was chasing. Running just as hard in the opposite direction. Calypsonian, panman, bassman, same thing. Must be the same thing for sculptor, dancer, poet too. I don't know. But I know about pan, I know about calypso. I know Winston and I know myself. Listen, Matt, listen. Winston and me is almost the same. I know what it takes to reach this place. I know the chasing and the running. The difference between me and Winston is he's a better man than I was. He better. He brave. Winston ain't no coward. He chase more than he run. And when he think about running, I was there to make sure he didn't run too far. Yeah, I take my credit. Yes, man, I was there to make sure he didn't run too far because I damn well know what that looked like. That is hell. That is fucking hell. Run too far from the music, run too far from what is yours, and that is fucking hell in truth. I could never let that happen to Winston. I know too good what that looked like. The bassman looks over the Gael from the wooden platform. He surveys the entire panyard, the scene he has staged carefully, the instruments he has righted and arranged. So I self lie this big Ash Wednesday morning. I lie when I say I'm angry with Winston. I am vexed. No. I might be frightened because I don't know what come next. I might feel how about how Winston tell this story, but it's his story to tell. I waste my chance when I had a story to tell. And now it's Winston who have his own story to tell, and I can't vex because he know what he know and I know what I know. The figure takes 2 pan sticks from his back pocket, the rubber mallets large. The figure, the bassman, hums the chorus to the now famous calypso, plays the bass parts of the arrangement in the bass gael. The bassman plays with his entire body. Each joint pivots in complex balance with the next. Each muscle flexes and softens, an intricate choreography. It is a dance displaying, a dance that inhabits the whole gael. He inhabits the entire gael. His features span time. His body and the music, a restless, reckless, circular creation, impossible to distinguish which generates which. The bassman plays, and the entire steel orchestra comes alive. The notes to Winston's calypso ring large. The bass notes dominate.
Thank you, Anton. I waste my chance when I had a story to tell, Farrell says. One of Breanne's characters, Bonnie, says a word can never really tell the truth of anything. Only someone who really studied English could understand, as I did, how meaningless and futile words were. Tell us about your stories and where they come from, who they're writing back to, and these notions of missed opportunities to tell stories and truth-telling.
Sure. So I think that when I was studying, I did actually study English, and when I was studying, one of those big seminal texts is Barth, The Death of the Author. And, okay, you understand in theory this whole thing, you know, the birth of the reader begins with the death of the author. But when I was in university, I was actually in a poetry group, and what you would do is you would write an anonymous poem and submit it. The whole poetry group would read the poem, and then at the end you have the opportunity to own up. And we did have quite a few that either because of the subject matter or it was just terrible, nobody admitted to it. And one of the most fascinating things there was actually experiencing the death of the author. Writing something and submitting it anonymously and hearing it debated, and sometimes people would find things that I absolutely wasn't in my head consciously or hadn't even been aware of. I wrote this sort of awful, pretentious first-year poem called Narcissus, and one of the Cambridge professors was critiquing it, and yes, this person is obviously very familiar with, you know, the original Greek text because of the use of the words. No. And that whole experience really showed me, you know, you might think you're writing something and putting it out into the world, and I've said what I have to say and I've made it very clear. And then it goes out to even a small group of people, and they read it totally differently. So that quote, that character, Bonnie, similar to me in that she studied English, and if you've read the story, not in many other ways, hopefully, is experiencing that sometimes it's very hard to say what you mean to say. Even if you've, you know, written something down and you think you've been clear, from the time you put it out there, it goes to somewhere else. And I think that that's what she's talking about, and that's what I've experienced.
Yeah, there's this thing where, yeah, once you put it out there, it no longer belongs to you, and that's a scary, scary thing. In terms of the quote about that you read, Colin, that's me on a page, right? And I think it's most writers, most artists, and I think with the Bassman piece, it's what the song says to me, that the process of trying to get a painting done or a sculpture done or a novel written is this beast that you wrestle with, and most of the times you want to run away from it. But here's the thing, if you run away from it, and to me, and that's how I created the Bassman character in my head, that he was this person doing this work for Shadow because he hadn't done what he needed to do, which is the scarier of the options, and it's the only one a little bit more scary. But going beyond that, the Shadow piece is here because one of the things I wanted to do is situate things that I think matter. So while I said this was about me having this experience with Caribbean literature, and so we have a story that is Jacques Roman, we have a lambing story and a Lovelace story and a Naipaul story, and you know, you hit those notes. I want to situate them also against those other people from the canon. So there's a Melville story and there's a Nabokov story, and I could not be done without putting a Shadow story in here because I think that's just as important. I think there's as much weight there as anybody else, as anything else in literature. And so part of what I'm trying to do in terms of saying, here's the work that is being done. I felt like part of the work I had to do is say, yeah, I want to put these things together.
Great. And so now it's your turn to talk to these wonderful authors. There's a mic that's coming down the aisle. Who wants to ask the first question? Oh, don't be shy. Let's call on Jeremy, who wanted to say a few words.
Sounds like Jeremy might just have to come up on stage and use the mic up here.
To do this at all.
Hello?
I was going to lie low and let Colin take the heavy lift. Yeah, just to say a couple of things about this. I want to say that these were books which came in roughly round about the same time. And what I found quite fascinating about them was the way in which, in very different ways, they're both obviously books about lived experience, but they're also books about how you can relate to other kinds of texts. And the ways in which one book heads off into lagahoos and folklore, and the other book heads into the direction of canonical literature and overturns them. I love one of the things that Anton told me. We were talking. One of the stories is, I won't give you away because you need to read the thing. One of the stories is based on the first chapter of Moby Dick, Melville's Moby Dick, and we were talking about that. And I said the basic story, which isn't giving away, is that when Ishmael, I was going to say, when Ishmael turns up at this place, there's nowhere to stay. So Ishmael, sort of asks, is there anywhere he can find a bed? And the innkeeper, who's a bit of a joker, says, yeah, you'll have to share the bed. So that Ishmael goes upstairs, he puts himself to bed, and then in comes Queequeg, who is heavily tattooed and kind of very much other, and that Ishmael is terrified in this, but then he gradually he settles down and says, and the chapter ends where Ishmael says, and I had the best night's sleep ever. And it's that was the little clue that I think that Anton began to sort of re-entangle that story and make something very, very different of it. And I think those are the things that we need to celebrate, the ways in which writers do things with other writing as much as they do with kind of with lived experience. And I think sometimes people are naive about the fact that so much poetry, so much writing is in fact written in relationship to other poetry and other writing. And, there is that constant sort of dialogue going on. So, yes, I think, that it was very pleasing to do these two books, which are kind of, seeming to go in different directions, but I think share an awful lot of kind of common territory. So that's really what I want to say.
Thank you. Has our mic recovered?
Any other questions?
There's one in front here.
Hi, everyone. Oh, look, the mic is working. Breanne, Anton, congratulations again on having these two collections.
Thanks, man.
Thank you, Brandon.
My one question, as someone who also writes, but has wrestled and been defeated many a time by a short story, my question is, how do you know when the short story is doing the thing that you wanted it to do or thought that it was going to do? And how do you know instead when the short story is instead telling you, this is what I want to do, throw away whatever misconceptions you may have about the intention that you have. I have this other thing that is being unraveled in the process.
I love that question. I mean, I love that question as like process question. And so the second option you said, to me, that's the gift, right? If the story jumps in and starts telling you what to do, like, you're good, right? I rather trust the story than me anytime. One of the ways I try to make that happen, because try and it don't always work, but one of the ways I try to make that happen is most of my stories, I have a place of start, a point of entry. And I was going to say start, but the point of entry isn't always the start. Sometimes the point of entry is the end. You know, so different points of entry. But I have the point of entry, and then the rest kind of builds around it. So in that building, it allows space for me to screw up and fix it and come back and rethink it. And it certainly allows space, hopefully, for the story to do that wonderful thing where it says, yeah, man, this is where I am supposed to be going. This is the work you have to do. Carry me there.
What I would add to that is that sometimes, because I've seen you writing, like I've seen you, Brandon, like working at it, like I'll go into Starbucks and he's there writing and I'm just there to get coffee and I'll be like, oh, should be writing. But, you know, I think that sometimes you need to give yourself space and sometimes it needs to be almost enforced space. Sometimes you have a work and you want to tinker with it and you want to tinker with it. And sometimes if you just give yourself a week, if you're like, let me just leave this, and then try to come back to it as if you're a reader. And then you can say, what is this story about? Sometimes just giving myself the space, it's been amazing to read and to say, oh, okay, something that seemed so challenging before, now that I've read it with a bit of space, I can tell exactly where the story is going. So I do think sometimes resist the urge to tinker and give yourself that little bit of space, and you might be surprised.
Thanks. Other questions? There we go. To the right, in the back.
Hi there. So congratulations to both of you as well, again. Breanne, I first got introduced to you as a writer through your group, the People's Republic of Writing. And now that you are doing your first collection, I guess the question that I wanted to ask is, how has that group and the ability to reach out to other people informed your process of writing, especially now that you've collected some of those things? And also whether there are some stories that you feel like so attached to or so like sensitive about that in your working of it you felt like it worked best keeping it to yourself until giving it to this.
And is Jonathan in the room?
No. So, I mean, I cannot overstate how wonderful the People's Republic of Writing, proud, not just my writing buddies, but some of my best friends are. Caroline and Andrea here, and my brother, the other member, is in Japan, but watching this on the live stream, I'm sure at whatever hour of the morning. They have been fantastic. We have, I think, a really close relationship, and what we would do is we would have writing sessions where people would submit things that they've written for comment, and reading sessions where we talk about what we've read. And I have sort of sent and resent some of these stories to them. And the feedback has been invaluable, both in terms of sometimes sort of convincing you that actually this story that you're telling is not the interesting thing. This part here, that's interesting. Take it and make it a story. Andre's like right there smiling at me. He did that for one of the stories in my collection called The One Night Stand. And I fought with him about it, and I was just like, absolutely not. What I wrote, that's good. You know, you can't make me change it. And eventually he said, just try going in another direction. And then Caroline, who is somewhere in the back, said, okay, just take Andre's advice. So sometimes, almost in spite of yourself, they push you in that direction. They lend you books to read. And I think also can't be overstated, just remind you that your stuff is good. That sounds kind of stupid, but I think all writers sort of go through a phase where you read something and you're like, it's terrible, I'm terrible, my goodness. Last year, I, for Bocas, was in something called Inspired by the Archives. So I was up in the archives reading Derek Walcott's manuscripts and drafts. And the drafts were so good. And this little black book that was just his notes were so good. And I was just like, my God, I hope this man wrote this for posterity and he knew it would be here. Because if this is just his babbling, you know, there's no hope. And just having some friends, even just a message and say, I'm terrible. And they'll be like, no, you're not. You know, don't worry, we'll get there. That's been great. So the second half of your question, if there's anything that I'd rather keep to myself, I think that initially there was, and I felt very much like, I can't write this. I can't put it out there. It's too close to someone I know or too close to something that happened. And I think that as the relationship developed for all of us, you put something out there and you know that, you know, even if somebody thinks, well, this sounds like your ex, you know, they're not going to make a big deal about it. They're going to be your first readers, and that they're close enough sometimes if to let you know, all right, so it might be personal to you, but that doesn't mean it's good. So, I mean, they've been wonderful. And yeah, thank you guys.
So yeah, Colin asked me if I want to jump in on that one too, and I think he's setting me up anyway to say this, but no, I know he isn't. But no, because that's real, right? So certainly, like, having people to share things with you and is necessary. You know, the work needs that, like plants need water. What in my acknowledgments at the back, I note a couple of people who are my base men, people who did that kind of thing that you're talking about, and said, listen, go and do the work, like, stop the pity party, move it. And my two base men that I refer to there are Colin Robinson and Ron Cummings, and they're people who have always come back and said, go and do the work. Here's this, be inspired. And Jeremy is one of those people who, whether he knows it or not, has done that just by saying, like, you have this space, come work.
Question at the back.
Hi, good afternoon. Breanne, you seem to deliberately try to locate your work in Trinidad and Tobago, almost to make a point that you are from Trinidad and Tobago, while dealing with some very, very complex social themes. Why is that? And then secondarily, why do you feel the need to blur the lines between the real and the supernatural, and is that part of locating everything within the context of the Caribbean and Trinidad and Tobago specifically?
So I think the decision to locate my stories in Trinidad was very natural, because I felt like a lot of the issues were things that had happened here, even if they could have been extended more broadly. And my writing style, I tend to be quite descriptive. So if I'm talking about, like, that excerpt I read, you know, the road to the Northern Range, I can see it myself. We've all done that drive so many times to Maracas or Las Cuevas. And so it seemed only natural to kind of locate my stories in Trinidad and to show the Caribbean. I also think that part of that, when I was living in the UK, in England and Scotland, the writers that were still very well known were sometimes sort of Naipaul and Walcott, who are excellent, but sometimes I would write something, and the feedback you got, this was a few years ago now, would be, well, but make it more Caribbean. And I would say, no, this is Caribbean. Like, I'm from Trinidad. This is something that I've experienced and something that I have lived through. You know, I'm telling you that this is here. The West Mall, the rituals, you know, that stuff is Caribbean. And a couple times when I was told, you know, my stuff wasn't representative, I would get a little upset and be like, you know, who are you to tell me that when I'm telling you I live here and this is representative of certain people's experience. But that's not all that is the Caribbean. The other side, the supernatural, I mean, I think that in Trinidad, the lines between what's real and what's spiritual are so blurred. I mean, I had recently, you guys all know this thing with the buck, a lunchtime conversation with my friends. And so we'll be in the lunchroom, people will have newspapers open, I'm normally reading a book, someone's reading the paper, and the conversation goes something like, you know, Bree, how do you get your eyeliner to stay in place? And I'll say, oh, well, after you draw it, you take the pencil and finish the line, you put the powder in, and someone will say, you'll believe this buck thing? And, you know, it's one conversation, it just goes seamlessly. And that conversation went into all kinds of things like, are sukuyas real, and do people sprinkle, you know, the salt? And so I think that in Trinidad, those lines are very blurred. We have these kind of folklore stories sort of in our bones, even if in theory we don't believe in anything. You know, you can't tell me that that's real. And so I think my stories deal with the very modern, the Starbucks, but also our history, you know, the Lagahoo, the Sukuya, maybe, maybe not, you know, maybe he is, maybe he's just crazy and he thinks he is. So that's what I try to do. And speaking of the death of the author, it's been interesting to get feedback from different people who read the same story and have come to different conclusions.
Any last questions? There's one right in front here.
Afternoon, everybody. First things first, congratulations to both writers. I personally have known Breanne for quite a while now. There are probably a few people in here that know her longer than I do. But my question is, as a young writer yourself, what piece of advice were you given when you were now starting out, or that you wish you were given, that when you were now starting out, that you would give to a young writer now who wants to take a bigger step to get their work out there?
Thank you, Olu. I know Olu since he was a baby. He was at my mom's nursery. Now he's a big man. So, not necessarily about writing, but something that helped me so much from writing was a piece of advice that came from my mom, which was very simple, but very apt, which was, do what you love. And I think that sometimes we hear that and we think, yeah, do what you love, great, do what you love. But what it boiled down to is find a way to do what you love. When I was in secondary school, I actually did science subjects all the way through to Form 5, sort of did well, placed in the Caribbean in subjects. And I went to secondary school that picks who they think are the scholarship winners, and they pick who they think are the President's Medal winners. And it was a fantastic school. I had a great experience there. And when I was going into Form 6, I said, I want to switch. I love English. I want to write. That's what I want to do. I want to switch. I want to study English. And when I went back into school, I saw I was signed up for English and Spanish, which were two subjects that I'd done. Now, I wanted to choose history, which is a subject I'd never done, and I was signed up for math. And I went and I said, no, I don't want to do math. And they said, okay, you have 2 art subjects there. You didn't do history, and if you do 3 art subjects, you'll come first in all your subjects in the Caribbean, but you won't win the President's Medal. If you do math, that is a subject where you get a high percentage. You will, you'll still be in the arts group, but you probably win the President's Medal. Think about it, think about how good that could be. You go all the way through to your PhD, you don't have to come back and work. And I said, look, I don't want to do it. And my mom, who's here and filming, came into the school, and she said, okay, it doesn't matter if she doesn't win the President's Medal. Let her switch to history. If she hasn't done it before and she doesn't do as well as in math, she won't do it. Let her switch. And I think that at the time, it was just an example of somebody who said, look, find a way to do what you love. You probably have to work a little bit harder because you didn't do history in Form 4 and Form 5. I did it. I came first in the Caribbean in all my subjects. I didn't win the President's Medal. I'm not sorry. I think that to me, find a way to do what you love, and having somebody who is sort of like a champion for me to say, you know what, I'm going to come in and help you do what you love. I mean, I studied English at university. I don't regret it. And so that's the advice I would give.
Thank you very much. You hear that, boy, Melon?
So Colin wants me to respond. I'll respond really quickly. I mean, I think one of the things you're doing is, you know, you're here and you're present and you're exposing yourself to this amazing opportunity that is Bocas Lit, and you're in the room with like people who I bow down to and people like me, and you know, working still. And so, you know, that it's the basic stuff. You read a lot, you write a lot, explore and get information. So you're on it, man. Keep going. Yeah.
Well, thank you all for coming out, and congratulations again to Anton and to Breanne. Pick up both books, Now After and Where There Are Monsters, and please, the writers will be meeting you outside to get them signed. Sorry? Oh, we've moved the signing to the rotunda of the library. So that's right where the booksellers are. And stay for...
Gordon Rolle's launch is up next.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Thank you.
Thank you so much.